All right, guys, we're back for the conclusion of economic transformations. And today we're going to look at, in Section 4, the commerce and people, the Atlantic slave trade. So we have discussed the Europeans taking part in Asian commerce, the silver trade. We've touched a little bit on the sugar trade, the fur trade, and now we're looking at trade in people. The Atlantic slave trade had major effects on 4 continents, Africa, Europe, and both North and South America. And we're going to examine some of the long-term consequences of the slave trade on each of these regions. So one begs to think, how did the Atlantic slave trade transform the social and economic systems within and across these regions? And so we'll look at that. And in addition to the broad sweep of trade systems, we'll also I think it's important maybe to look at some individual narratives of the slave experience. Contextualization often involves exploring a specific situation in order to make a better judgment about a larger process. In the history of enslavement, like many processes in history, the personal stories of those millions of people is very important and can bear some light on what they actually went through. And so you'll get a better understanding of the Atlantic system as a whole. And regional trade networks intensified and transformed during this period. And those transoceanic voyages of the early modern world were built on technological developments and knowledge from the Islamic and Asian worlds. So, think about the innovations like astrolabes, lantine sails, the improved understanding of wind and currents, the caravel, all those that made long voyages during this period possible. All right, commerce and people, the Atlantic slave trade. So, between the mid-14th and mid-19th centuries, the Atlantic slave trade took an estimated 10.7 million people from Africa to the Americas. Millions more died in the process, so this was a vast human tragedy. And the African slave trade transformed the societies of all the participants. The African diaspora created racially mixed societies in the Americas on a large scale, and the slave trade and slavery itself enriched many. But it also became a metaphor for many types of social oppression. So let's start with the slave trade in context. Right? Let's put this in a process and an understanding. Most human societies have had slaves. Africans had practiced slavery and sold slaves for centuries. The trans-Saharan trade took slaves to the Mediterranean world, and as well as the East African slave trade. And so there have been a variety of slaveries before 1500. So prior even to the Atlantic slave trade, the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean were main centers of slavery, with Russia and the sub-Saharan Africa, like I mentioned. They're all important sources of slaves, so much so that Slav became the root word for slave. So much of this trade was in the hands of Muslim merchants who preferred even female slaves. And so, slavery really depended on the region and the time period. Slaves were often assimilated into their owners' households, and sometimes the children of slaves were free, sometimes they became slaves themselves. In the Islamic world, like I had said, preferred female slaves. Even more so, the margin was about 2 to 1 of female slaves to male slaves. And not all slaves had lowly positions in the Islamic world. Many slaves had military or political status, and some even did contract work like architecture or the arts. But most pre-modern slaves worked in households, farms, or shops. So there was a distinctiveness of slavery in the Americas. It was very unique. The Atlantic slave trade was unique for several reasons. The scale and size of some millions of Africans were sent on the Middle Passage It's estimated that almost 2 million died before reaching the Americas, and the slaves were primarily male and used overwhelmingly for plantation agriculture. And slave status in this particular instance became hereditary. And slaves had no rights at all. And the slaves were racially distinct Africans. So the scale and importance of the slave trade in the Americas was enormous. Like I said, it was largely based on agricultural or plantation agriculture, and there was little hope of manumission or being granted freedom. And what's ironic about this Atlantic slave trade and Atlantic slavery is the widespread slavery in a society that valued human freedom and equality unlike anywhere else except for maybe ancient Greece. And so that's how slavery became wholly identified with Africans and being distinct and being different. Now, the origins of Atlantic slavery lay in the Mediterranean with sugar production. As sugar made its way from India into the Mediterranean, sugar production is a labor-intensive process that requires a lot of people, and so slavery is ideal. And since sugar production was the first modern industry that took major capital investment, technology, disciplined workers, and then providing to a mass market, the work was very difficult and dangerous. So slaves were ideal. And at first, the Slavs from the Black Sea region provided most of the slaves for the Mediterranean sugar plantations. But the Portuguese found an alternative slave source in West Africa as they set up sugar plantations in the Americas, particularly Brazil. And so the Europeans learned about sugar production from the Muslims and those sugar plantations. And they initially they'd used white slaves, but like I said, the Portuguese had found an alternative in West Africa. So Africans became the primary source of slave labor in the Americas. But why Africans? Well, Slavs were not available. The Native Americans had died from European diseases. So as the great dying made Native American labor scarce, the Europeans had difficulty with the tropical environment and diseases, and so plantation owners had to look elsewhere. And Africa was geographically close, and so the Portuguese had already discovered the existing African slave markets, and so they just bought into that. And the Pope actually sanctioned the slavery of Muslims and pagans. And racism played a role. Europeans inherited some aspects of Islamic racism and surely developed their own type of racism against Africans. And so the Europeans felt that other Europeans were a bad alternative. Christians from marginal lands couldn't be enslaved, and indentured servants were expensive. The Africans were farmers, especially on some large-scale agriculture. They were at least familiar. They had some immunity because of previous contact with Europeans. They weren't Christian, and they were readily available. And so that made the Africans ideal for slavery in the Americas. Okay, let's look at this map that shows you the direction here in red, the African diaspora and where they went to. And here's some over here in the East African slave trade by the Brazilian or Portuguese. But you can see right here in these green areas were the origins of those slaves, where they went, and then in purple showing where they ended up, their destination. Okay, the slave trade in practice. So we looked at the slave trade in context. Now let's look at it in practice. The slave trade was driven by European demand. The Europeans didn't raid Africa for slaves, but they traded freely with African merchants and the elites. And so from capture to sale on the coast, trade was strictly in African hands. Africans received trade goods in return, and even, which was actually often bought with American silver. So that's how 3 continents are encompassed together there. And it was a horrible journey for slaves. They would pack hundreds in these ships where there wasn't enough room to even sit up. They'd all have to lay down together, and they just packed them on top of each other, all chained together. And it was awful. They didn't get, and the trip from Africa to the Americas, months long, they gave them barely any food. There was nowhere to go to the bathroom. And so if you got sick, it was awful. And because it was ideal, there was an increasing pace to the Atlantic slave trade. Between 1450 and 1600, there were fewer than 4,000 slaves that were shipped annually. But with the sugar production that developed in the Caribbean and throughout other parts of the 17th century, the average of about 10,000 slaves per year were taken to the Americas. So it more than doubled in the 1600s. So who was enslaved? Well, people from West Africa, primarily. We saw that on the map, which is present-day Mauritania and Angola. Mostly people from marginal groups like prisoners of war, debtors, criminals. And the Africans generally did not sell their own peoples. They went to other tribes for that. Now, the vast majority of slaves ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean. Smaller numbers were sent to North America or mainland Spanish America or even some in Europe. And about 15% of those that were enslaved died during the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is that trip from Africa to the Americas across the Atlantic. So 15 out of every 100 didn't make it for various reasons. They had too much cargo and couldn't support the number they had traded for, or disease, or any random number of things, uprisings, whatever. But there were some consequences, the impact. Let's look at the impact of the slave trade. It created new trans-regional linkages between the 4 continents. It actually slowed Africa's growth, which makes complete sense. This is the loss of millions of people, primarily working age men, and so that slowed the growth of African populations and slowed economic development. But at the same time, Europe and China expanded in population. Sub-Saharan Africa had about 18% of the world's population in 1600, but only 6% in 1900. That is just crazy to think about. And because of that, it generated economic stagnation and political disruption in Africa. The involvement in the capture and sale of human beings had a corrupting effect on African societies. And that led to reactions such as the Limba cult and some other things that happened in Africa. And the rising labor demands on women and even polygamy. There were fewer men, and so there was an increased demand for women for agricultural labor within Africa. And the numbers also made it possible for men to take multiple wives. Those who profited didn't invest in production in Africa. So that also was a big part of the economic stagnation. There were no investments into economic development. There were no breakthroughs in agriculture or industry, no technology developments. And since Europeans didn't increase the demand for Africa's products, they just wanted its people. Now, there were also social effects that fostered moral corruption and that unbalanced sex ratio in Africa. So like I said, that substantially increased that labor for demand for labor on women. There we go. And those polygamous households, multiple wives. It also led to an increased use of female slaves within West Africa. And very few women benefited by marrying European merchants, while some operating actually their own trading empires. Women did participate in state-building empires. For example, the kingdom of Dahomey was ruled over by a queen mother. And the kingdom of Congo, women held lower administrative positions and even served on the monarch's council of advisors. And Matamba also had some female rulers. So there were some new opportunities for women. The merchants' activity of the trade did allow women to find new riches as entrepreneurs and taking on those political roles. But the effect of the slave trade differed from place to place. Many small-scale kinship-based societies were thoroughly disrupted. Some larger kingdoms like the Congo and Oyo slowly disintegrated because of this, but Benin in the forest area of present-day Nigeria succeeded in limiting the effects of the slave trade until the 1700s. So it's important to keep in mind that these African states had options. They had choices. So it's important to remember that the Africans participated in a market and could choose to opt out. So like I said, Benin, for example, they engaged in trade but not the slave trade, unlike its neighbor Dahomey, which on the other hand did enter the slave trade in a big way. And so they actively participated. And that was even put under royal control. And the annual slave raids by the army, the Dahomey army, were conducted. The government actually depended on the slave trade for revenue. And that was also a main factor. And that sums up the slave trade. Hopefully you guys got a lot out of chapter 14 and these economic transformations with commerce and the consequences thereof. And I will give you some reflections and visual sources and some things to think about. All right, see you next time.